Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, I want to look at one of my favorite topics. That is the relationship between the variability in our performance and our movement outcomes and the variability in the execution, the actual process that produces those outcomes. So, the variability between outcome variability and movement variability. And in particular, I'm going to focus on, how we do use variability to be accurate in our movements. So I've talked about this many times before, right? In episode 156 of the podcast, I talked about this question of how consistently do we need to move to be consistently successful. Also, in my favorite papers from 2020, I think the second one, I looked at this, excuse me, baseball study where they showed the relationship between the kinematics, the variability in the kinematics of the pitching delivery, and the location of the pitch. So I've talked to this before. And of course, in those, I laid out kind of the two different views of this, right? The traditional view of information processing view is that movement variability is noise, right? And the way that we have a repeatable outcome is by a repeatable movement, right? So repetition of outcome through repetition of movement, right? So the idea of training is to reduce be as repeatable as possible, reduce variability, right? That's a traditional view. So if we look at this in the bigger picture, and I'm going to come back to this, later on, we want low performance outcome variability, right? No matter what theory you're talking about, we want that. That's consistency, right? That's hitting your target every time. That's making a pass to your teammate that's right on their foot every time, right? We want our performance outcomes to be consistent. No one's arguing that. The debate is how you get there, right? And the idea in the traditional theory is it's through repeatability, right? Low movement variability, which is created by low variability of conditions and practice, right? Block practice, isolated practice, repetition, learning the technique, right? That's the traditional view. The alternative view, of course, is the ecological view that dismisses this, rejects this idea of movement variability as noise, instead argues that it's functional, right? That in order to repeat our outcomes, we need to vary our movements, right? Repetition without repetition, right? Classic Bernstein idea. So low outcome variability requires a significant amount of movement variability because the constraints are changing, right? If we want to produce this. So again, we want low performance outcome variability, but this is created by a significant amount of movement variability. It's functional. It's keeping us on our target, achieving our goal by varying our movement from execution to execution. It's repetition without repetition. And of course, this connects back to variability of practice. We want a relatively high amount of variability in practice to allow you to adapt and problem solve and develop this functional variability, right? So critical in understanding this, I think, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, is understanding what kind of variability are we talking about, right? For me, there's three different types. There's performance outcome variability, the variability in our results we're trying to produce, which we always want to be low usually. Then movement variability, which we can break down further, and I'll talk about that later. And then variability of practice, right? So a key thing in these theories is how these things relate to each other. So I'll come back to this later on. But the paper, and I should mention before I move on, this idea of functional variability, of course, in the ecological view is inherent, links to Bernstein's idea of motor synergies, right? Not only are we just the way that we achieve functional variability, one of the main ways is through covariation, right? So our variability in one part of our movement is being compensated for by a variability in the other, right? Which is a motor synergy. So our elbow angle and shoulder angle are working together. They're co-varying to keep our outcome consistent, right? So they work together. The idea of covariation or muscle synergy. So the paper I want to talk about today that addresses these ideas is a very recent one published in the Journal of Motor Behavior looking at baseball pitching, right? And I thank the authors. I asked them to send me a copy when it just came out. It just came out like a few days ago when I'm recording this, and they were nice enough to send me a copy. So this paper is looking at these questions. And the authors frame this question in terms of the speed accuracy trade-off, right? So the idea is that if we want to be accurate, which, in this case, accuracy, we're talking about consistency, consistently hitting your target as a pitcher, right? That's accurate. The catcher's mitt, right? Where they put it, you want to consistently hit it. That's what we mean by accuracy. The idea in motor control is that as we speed up, right, as we try to speed up our movement, we have this trade-off, right? Because the signals we use in our motor system to motor commands become more noisy, right? The electrical signals become more noisy the faster we move, right? So we have this limitation when we want to move fast, in this case, throwing at a high velocity, it's harder to be consistent. It's harder to achieve a low variability in outcome. So the question they are trying to address, and the question of the day, is how do skilled performers overcome this trade-off, which they certainly do, right? In any sport, you see people that are both fast and accurate, right? In golf, people can drive 350 yards right down the middle of the fairway. So the people are achieving this. Question is how, right? And what they're going to look at in this study, as I mentioned, is baseball pitching. And what they're going to talk about is how do we throw with both a high velocity and accuracy. And what they're going to talk about is in terms of the parameters of the pitch, right? And what they're talking about here is the parameters of the release of the pitch, right? So what they describe in the paper, and they develop a model of this for their study, is that the pitch, right, the where a pitch goes is related to basically 9 parameters of a pitcher's release, right? Their hand position, how high is their hand, what angle is it at, the velocity of the release, and any spin you put on it, right? There's other factors, obviously the air, things that affect it in the flight, but those are the primary factors that influence where the ball is going to go. These 9 parameters I can control, right? As a pitcher, I can control those things. So there's those 3 things with each XYZ dimensions, right? So I can control where my hand is. I control how hard I throw it. I can control how much spin I put on it. How does a pitcher regulate those 9 parameters in order to consistently hit the catcher's mitt, right? And be able to throw at a high velocity. So the 2 ideas related to the 2, traditional views of this, the traditional view and the ecological view, is the one idea we could do is we could consistently hit the catcher's mitt, have high accuracy by having low variability in those parameters. So having the same hand position every time I release it, releasing the ball at the same angle, right? Having consistency. And so I'm getting low variability in outcomes through repeatability of movement, right? And there's certainly a data that supports this. It seems to support this. I should say, I'm going to come back to this later on. From people from ASMI, Glenn Feistig and colleagues, for example, the data showing that the variability of movement, right? If you look at, for example, where a pitcher's foot lands, the variability, the standard deviation goes down and down and down and down as you go higher and higher in skill level, right? So Major League Baseball pitchers are more consistent in where their foot lands in the pitching delivery than the kids or college players, right? So that idea that they're more accurate in pitch location because they're more consistent in movement. They have a repeatable delivery, right? That's one way that we could solve this speed accuracy trade-off. The other one, of course, is the covariation idea, right? So the idea here is I'm not going to try to just consistently have a same release point. I'm going to covary my release point with the spin or something like that, or release angle and release velocity, right? So I can make those 2 things work together. So if one is a little bit more variable, the other one can adjust, right? And this is essentially the idea of same conceptual idea as a motor synergy, right? 2 parameters of my movement varying together, co-varying, not independently. So they're overall, they're going to have high variability, right? Not low. We're not trying to repeat the same movement. From pitch to pitch, my release angle is going to be a little bit different because the things are co-varying. And then the paper, they use the term coordinated covariation, right? That's when 2 parameters of, in this case, they're talking about this release point parameters are varying, right? So those are the 2 alternatives. The study essentially was trying to set up a study to test these 2. Which one seems to be the way that pitchers just consistently hit their target, right? So they're going to try to look at the relative contribution of reducing the variability in those outcome parameters versus covariation. And they kind of have this hypothesis embedded in the writing and the introduction that they don't think, even though there's some studies that have shown evidence for covariation, for example, the one I talked about in the video I mentioned at the start, that usually these typically involve low speed pitching, and they believe that at a high speed you cannot do this kind of covariation, right? So that's kind of inherent in their thing. So in the study, what they did, they took 12 baseball pitchers from, this is done in Japan. One of them was a former professional in Japanese leagues. So they were varying skill levels. They were asked to throw 30 fastballs to the catcher's mitt. Okay, so which is going to be important later on. I'm going to point out. They're doing the same action over and over, the same pitch over and over. Their only instruction was to hit the catcher's mitt and throw as fast as possible. They used equipment called a TrackMan, which measures the flight of the ball and all the movement parameters, so they could measure the release point, the release angle, the release speed, spin, and everything else. And from this, they used a model of how those things relate to the pitch location, which of course they also measured. How consistent was the location? And the method they used to tease apart these two hypotheses of repeatability versus covariation was a method that I talked about that back in that video. So go back if you're interested. Go and look at the second article in my 2020 favorite articles on my YouTube channel. They used what's called the permutation method, which was a really cool method. I really like it a lot, developed by Muller and Standard in 2003. The idea is of the permutation method is, say I take one of your movements, so one of your pitching deliveries, and I measure a bunch of things about it. I measure your elbow angle, your knee angle, your hip angle, your shoulder angle, right? I look at how the variability, and then I look at the variability in pitch location, right? How consistently you pitch, right? If there's no covariation, and I have a model that relates those two things. If I have no covariation going on, then I should be able to scramble your movements, right? I should be able to take your elbow angle from the third throw you made and combine it with the shoulder angle from the second and the knee angle from the fifth, right? And it should produce the same consistency and outcome, right? If things aren't co-varying, if all you're trying to do is on every trial make those things as consistent and low variability as possible, then it shouldn't matter how that they come from the same delivery, right? Because they're not working together at all. Whereas if they do, right, then it should matter, right? So if I scramble, so in this previous study I was talking about, they scrambled the deliveries. So they combined these reconstructed deliveries. And what they found was when you scramble them, the variability of the outcome gets much higher, right? Suggesting that covariation and synergies are going on, right? If I take away within the same trial, they're working together. If I make them in different deliveries, they're no longer going to work together, right? So that's the idea. So this study used that method and found evidence. They found higher variability in location when you scrambled. Okay. This present study used essentially the same method, except they're not using body angles, elbow angles, shoulder angles, which is actually going to be important and later on. They're using these release parameters, right? The XYZ of the position, the spin, so on. Okay. So what they're going to do is compare your actual data, those parameters from the same one delivery versus the scrambled condition, which they call hypothetical, right? So they're going to take them from different deliveries, different of those 30 deliveries. And they did both cases where you scramble everything, and then they also did cases where you just scramble one of the parameters, right? And they calculated this measure they call the index of coordination, which basically compares the variability in the outcome, the pitch location, for the real actual throwing of a single trial versus when we scramble it, right? And the point is if this index of coordination is greater than 1, it means motor synergies are going on. You're more consistent in outcome when we take all the points from the same execution, right? You can't have covariation across trials, across deliveries, right? It has to all be within the same delivery. So that's the basic idea of what they did. What did they find? Right? What they found was no real evidence of covariation or motor synergies, right? The index of coordination was not significantly different from 1 for all the parameters they measured. So they did these modeling where they scrambled one parameter, kept the others constant, then did another, and so on. For example, they did the speed, the elevation angle, the spin, the release point X, release point Y, height, and all these things. And they found in no case was the index of coordination greater than 1, which means essentially it didn't matter whether you scrambled them or kept them from the same delivery, right? So the conclusion they make is that there's no evidence of this covariation going on. if you read the paper, they do acknowledge that if you look at within individual pictures, there's some that had a higher IC than one, suggesting there may be some individual differences, that some pictures are doing covariation and some are not, right? So the bottom line conclusion they make is that pitchers achieve consistent outcomes, locate the pitch accurately and consistently by reducing the variability, not covariation, right? And they explain why they think this is right. They argue that, for example, the release angle, if you look at the relationship between release angle and pitch location, that has an overwhelming amount of effect on that, right? So that variable is so strong, you need to keep it consistent. You can't let it co-vary, okay? So they're decreasing and by improving the reproducibility of the release angle rather than using coordinated covariation. They also make, as hinting back to what I talked about earlier on, they also argue that the reason that this occurs, and it's not consistent with the previous research, like the one I reviewed in the video, is that because at high speeds, you can't do this coordinated covariation, right? As you get higher and higher speed, it can't be achieved. So they argue that their difference between their results and other studies, although they don't actually talk, I don't think they actually talk about the one that I reviewed. It's probably likely because their paper was in review when it came out, but that it's due to the speed difference. Okay, so that's the general conclusion they make. The argument that it seems like pitchers are consistently achieving movement outcomes by using a repeatable delivery, right? That's would be their bottom line execution. What do I think? Well, I don't agree with that conclusion overall for a few reasons. First of all, though, I'll touch on the speed explanation. As I said, the authors likely didn't have access to the paper that I reviewed in the video, but if you look at their pitchers were throwing on average about 73, 75 miles an hour. And the study I reviewed in the video by Matsuo et al. In 2020, which showed evidence of covariation, the scrambling did effect, they were throwing even faster, right? So the pitch speed argument, and I don't know why, like if you really understand how motor synergies work, there's no real limitation due to speed, right? As I've talked about before, that's kind of a misconception about online control and perspective control, that it breaks down if you move too fast, right? Not necessarily, right? The other thing I would point out, right? This is kind of a problem I always point out with a lot of these studies, right? A lot of these studies are looking for evidence of covariation and functional variability, motor synergies, etc., in conditions where the constraints are not changing at all, right? The pitcher is making the same pitch over and over, they're throwing as hard as possible to the same location using the same pitch type, the same fastball. Maybe they're getting fatigued a little bit. So there obviously, there are some changes in constraints that there always are, but they're very, very minimal. Yeah. And why is that important? Well, the reason we have covariation, the reason we have motor synergies, where it really shines is when things change, right? That's what it's built for. It's built to adapt to changing constraints. But the biggest problem, and it's not a problem, it's a issue with the interpretation, I would say, is the level of analysis that this paper is doing, right? To me, they're looking for covariation, this coordinated covariation in the wrong place, right? And this goes back to something I talked about earlier on when we look at the relationship between, the different types of variability, right? Variability of practice, variability of movement, variability of performance outcomes, right? Within movement, right? Bernstein talked about this, right? Within movement, Bernstein called these essential variables and elementary variables, right? Within movement, there are going to be certain parameters that we want to be consistent, right? We can have a consistent, the release point of the pitch, right, is not the performance outcome, the where your hand is in space. It's a movement parameter, but that could likely be an essential variable, right? You can consistently keep a parameter of your movement the same on every trial, okay? When we're talking about kind of this process thing, the release point and things like that, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that you do that by using the same movement to get there, right? Those are the elemental variables, the joint angles, right? So I could have the same release point, low variability and release point, by having high variability from trial to trial in my shoulder, elbow, which is what the study I reviewed essentially showed. So while this study is measuring the release parameters, which you're likely expect to be fairly consistent, another example of this comes from like some of Tim Buzzard's work when you look at the relationship between the shoulder and the racket in tennis, right? That's an essential variable that you want to keep consistent, but you don't do it by moving exactly the same way every time, right? So I think because they're measuring these release parameters, they're looking for covariation in the wrong place. We're not going to have covariation in the release point, I wouldn't think. We're going to have covariation in what produced that release point, right? The elbow angle, the shoulder angle, the movements that got it there, right? That's where we expect to see covariation. And that's what you see in this other study, right? So the possibility, the low variability and release point, which is what they found in this study, and the fact that there's no covariation going on there does not rule out the possibility that there's covariation going on before the release, right? And previous research seems to suggest that, right? So I don't think overall this study supports the idea that the key to accurate pitching is repeatability or low variability. I don't think it's key. It tells us something, and it is a good study and important, showing that the key to a consistent pitching is having these release parameters consistent. These are essential. It's identifying the essential variables, I would say, but it's not showing us what goes on before to produce that, which other research suggests involves covariation in motor synergies. So overall, a really interesting study. I think adds more to this kind of story, but I would kind of put my own spin on it, obviously. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. And if you're interested in helping me, if you got some value from this, if you want to add some value back to me, I would really appreciate it. Trying to do some more things with the podcast coming in the future, and kind of the support helps me add new things and new twists to it and keep doing this. So if you're interested in kind of supporting the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/perception action. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now. And keep them coupled, of course.